Hey guys, it's Hiba. I want to tell you about a company my friend Michael started. It's called Unsettled. Imagine a Lebanese entrepreneur, a Canadian scientist, and a Mexican Netflix producer having dinner together. That's a typical scene from an Unsettled retreat, and some of those dinner party guests have been Casey listeners. Unsettled runs retreats for working professionals who need a break from their routine. The co-working retreats are for creatives, entrepreneurs, and freelancers in places like Bali, Buenos Aires, and Tuscany, to name a few. Unsettled has had more than 1,000 people join the retreats from over 70 countries. So if you're looking to live and travel differently, find all the details for your next recharge at liveunsettled.co, or just Google Unsettled. And if you mention Kerning Cultures, you'll get 5% off your first 2-week or 1-month retreat. Now let's start the show.
From Beirut, and I have been doing street art.
More than is predictable, they've seen it happen.
And one story that always kind of captures my imagination.
Bed in the morning, dreading going in because I'm going to have to stand in front of
The streets lost culture.
And you're listening to Kerning Cultures. In 2009, headlines across Western media were celebrating what they called a Beirut comeback. Lebanon's capital was being revered as a top tourism destination. But the truth often lies in the things that can't speak. So today, we have a story for you about trying to capture the voices of the voiceless. The stories of the monuments, the homes, the buildings that bore witness to the city's past, and their remains that stand today as proof. Join us now on this tour of Beirut with our guide, Ronnie Chatah. I'm Hiba Fisher, and you're listening to Kerning Cultures, radio documentaries from the Middle East.
It can get a bit loud at this stop. If you can't hear what I'm saying, just tell me to project. Can everyone hear me? Good.
So we're standing in front of the Holiday Inn in downtown Beirut,
Our story today comes to us from producer Alex Atack.
which is basically seen as one of the city's most obvious reminders of the Civil War. It stands shelled out and dotted with bullet holes. It's this kind of grey hunk of tower.
You're looking at a hotel that was open for 1 year only.
It's a monster, right in the heart of the city.
That's Ronnie.
Ronnie Chatah. I guess the best title for me is storyteller, or narrator of the city's past.
The hotel became strategic during the war.
If you stand at the bottom of it and look up, you kind of see where all the old windows used to be and where all the balconies would have looked out over the Mediterranean. But now they're just these empty black holes. And the cliched story that kind of gets told again and again is that it's this monument to the juxtaposition between Beirut's past and present. But when I stood underneath it with Ronnie, watching him give his tour of downtown Beirut to about 40 people, he told a more personal story.
The Holiday Inn was famous for three things: its size, that rotating balcony, the restaurant at the top, and lesser known fact, which is the luxury cinema, a boutique cinema below it called the St. Charles. And we're talking, leather chairs and velvet curtains and all that. So, if you wanted to impress your date, you would take them to that cinema or maybe take them to the restaurant upstairs.
He kind of half-jokingly told us that he was a product of the hotel. Right before the war started, his parents had had one of their first dates there.
One of their first romantic dates. So it's also a way to look back, even if it's falling apart and stripped bare and war-torn.
The hotels which made Beirut the tourist center of the Middle East are now strategic forts, won in street-by-street, floor-by-floor battle.
One of the most iconic images to emerge from the war is a billow of black smoke rising from a fire inside the hotel.
It was so well covered during the Civil War. There is so much footage of the Holiday Inn. You can stand there, you can see it, you can listen to stories about it. You can also go home and watch what happened. You can actually watch it falling apart. You can watch it on fire. You can watch people getting killed. And I think that is part of the Holiday Inn story, is that it was so well covered, it became almost the telltale for who was winning and who was losing during the Civil War.
The hotel was only open for 1 year when the Lebanese Civil War broke out. And when it did, Ronnie's parents left Lebanon for the US.
They fled in 1976, 1 year into the Civil War.
His dad got a visa to move to Texas.
To study at the University of Texas. That's where I was born.
So Ronnie wasn't born in Lebanon, but his early relationship to Lebanon, or his early exposure to Lebanon when he was young, was through these like storybooks, these kind of nostalgia books, as he called them.
Our home was full of these nostalgia books. So you have these sort of old pictures of the country before the war broke out. These are 1960s photos, early 1970s. And it's funny to see how different this country is today, that it's so built up now. It's hard to really experience the glory days of Beirut and Lebanon, because I think that's permanently gone. But these photos are nice to kind of, it's almost like an exercise in imagination, see what the country used to look like.
And these kinds of photos that he's talking about, you see them at every tourist shop in Beirut. They're these kind of high saturation, rose-tinted tributes to Beirut's glory days. They show Beirut locked in a state of prosperity that it never returned to after the war.
My earliest memories of Beirut are war-torn downtown. In the early 90s, you could still see a lot of the mess that was left from the Civil War. You had trees everywhere, you had stray dogs. There were still landmines. You couldn't go anywhere without sort of having some guided access. It was risky.
So Ronnie grew up with Beirut under Reconstruction, and those same neighborhoods that he'd always known to be unsafe, by the time he was older, they transformed into what you'd now recognize as downtown Beirut. In 2006, he started giving these kind of informal tours to visiting students.
The walking tour itself was something I discovered by accident. I was visiting Berlin in 2002, and all I knew about Berlin was war, Cold War, wall, all that, and I was lost. But then I actually joined a walking tour there. I think it was about 6 hours long. And I enjoyed it so much. And I felt like that I was now part of an experience, part of a story. And I really enjoyed it, really, really enjoyed it. So that was there in the background. A few years later, I was maybe unintentionally, without realizing it, I was trying to sort of replicate that kind of experience here.
When he started it out, he'd just take them around Ras Beirut and a little bit into downtown. He was doing that for a few years, and then by 2009...
Beirut hopes to cap over 2 million visitors in the year 2009, and when you consider the population of Beirut, that doubles the population of Beirut.
It's one of the last bastions of coexistence in a region beset by war. On the surface, at least, the city is reunited.
2009 was a good year for the country. We were sort of celebrated. This was the #1 city to visit, according to the New York Times. And a few Western outlets were very favorable towards Beirut. So there was a wave of tourism. People were looking for a walking tour, and I was the only one offering that kind of tour, because I think Beirut is very hard to explain. A good example is a neighborhood like Martyrs Square. You could go there today and have no idea what that thing is. It's a broken statue in the middle of a giant parking lot. You need someone to actually tell you what this is. And that Martyrs Square is where this country has tried 3 times to get it right. This is the same location Beirutis went to challenge Turkish rule. It's the same location where Lebanese demanded the French leave. And not too long ago, it was where at least 1 million Lebanese showed up calling on the Syrians to leave. And that's what makes it magical, even today.
After the Holiday Inn, the tour moved on to Lover's Lane, which is this kind of pathway which runs past some Roman ruins. And as we sat down on the bench, there was this couple, and Ronnie kind of joked with them that every week he interrupts their Sunday evening by bringing 40 tourists to sit down on the bench next to them.
And I think the last 4 tours, I've ruined this couple's moment. I'm always embarrassing this man. I apologize again. Couples come here to run away from their parents.
And along the way, cars zip past and they're kind of blasting music, and Ronnie's joking with people calling out the windows to us. And you can just tell that being on the streets and explaining Beirut to people like this is kind of when Ronnie's in his element.
This layered part of the city. It's one of the oldest parts of Beirut. When you look around, it doesn't look old. The truth is,
Ronnie was telling stories of Beirut's best days and its worst days, and he says he'd always tried to remain objective in the version of events that he told. But in 2013, his family was sucked into the story of political unrest that he'd recounted hundreds of times.
It was a massive car bombing, and it echoed throughout the city. And most assassinations, you can hear them when you're in Beirut. I heard the explosion, and for a few minutes I thought there was a construction site next to where I was living. I thought something may have fallen. But by maybe 15, 20 minutes after it happened, my intercom was buzzing. My friend who helps on the tour, she sort of came over, and she had heard on the news, she was in a taxi, on the radio, she had heard that it was my father.
Ronnie's dad, who was a Lebanese politician, was assassinated in downtown Beirut.
I found out by basically pushing her away from me because she did not want me to see my phone. I went outside the apartment. I left her inside. I went to my phone, and within maybe a few seconds after that, I realized what had happened. And then after that, everything went to hell. You begin living the rotten part of Lebanon, right? And it becomes part of you.
2 days later, Ronnie buried his dad right next to Martyrs Square. And this is a place that Ronnie had always told the history of on his tour. But now the square had taken on a whole new meaning for him. He stopped doing the tour, and he says he didn't want to be in Lebanon anymore.
I didn't think I could do anything here especially if I wasn't doing the tour. I thought that, what am I still doing here? My father was killed. There's no trial. The criminals that did this got away. Why am I still here? This country, by and large, when there's an assassination, there's either no investigation or there's no attempt to really punish those involved.
So in September 2014, he moved to Scotland.
Never imagined that I would end up in Scotland. Never thought I'd visit Scotland or go there. My girlfriend, who's now my fiance, she was accepted to a University of Edinburgh. And we agreed that we would leave this country together.
Over the next 4 years, he studied for his master's in literature. And at the start of this year, at the start of 2018, he came back to Lebanon just for a visit.
I had detached myself for a long time. I had not been back for years, so I decided to see everyone that I missed dearly and sort of just come to terms a bit.
An education program had been started in his dad's name, and he wanted to raise extra funds to cover the costs of it. So he did the tour one more time.
So I thought I'd do one tour. I just literally thought, you know what, I'll do it one more time.
But when he started publicizing it, nearly 500 people emailed him wanting to book a spot.
And you cannot do 500 people. This just doesn't work. So I said I'd spread them out over a course of 3 or 4 tours. A few hundred people were still booking. So it's like it reached insane levels very early on. So I'm like, no, I have to stay and do this a little longer. And I've been doing it every week since January.
When he started the tour again, he only gave a small mention to his personal connection with Martyrs Square. He said he thought it would be damaging to the tour and that he wanted to keep it about the city. He didn't want to make it about himself.
I thought it's not fair to tell a story that you're part of. That if you're going to be a neutral storyteller, you should just say things as they are and not get into it. But you know what? It just doesn't feel right. So in April, I just said, that's it. I can't do this. I have to get into the story. So then I flipped that stop on its head.
I went on Ronnie's walking tour this summer, and at the end of the tour, we all gathered around the statue in the middle of Martyrs Square. And once everybody sat down in a circle, Ronnie paced around the group and read a piece of writing that he'd written during those 4 years in Scotland.
You're holding what's left of him. The 11th assassination in that decade of death. His opponents, fearful of compromise, chose to end him in broad daylight. With his weight above and below me, I honor that truth. Despite the country's divisions, despite its delusions, this is the place we rally our cause. In pain and prosperity, through triumph and tragedy, my Buddhaj, my father, my martyr, my honor. I stopped giving the tour December 27, 2013, the day my father was assassinated. But I hope you enjoyed this part of the tour. I'm sorry I'm getting a little emotional. As a way of saying thank you for letting me share this with you, I'll give you a small treat. Old postcards from Martyrs Square.
When he was done, he started handing out postcards, and on the postcard he gave me was a photograph of Martyrs Square, and it was taken just a year before the Civil War started. It shows a square lined with tall palm trees and manicured hedges. The pavements are packed with pedestrians and the roads are lined with classic sports cars. In the middle of the picture stands the same statue that we were standing underneath, but that's the only thing that stayed the same. When you look around you, only one of the original buildings from Martyrs Square still stands, and nowadays it's a Dunkin' Donuts. These are the same kinds of photographs that Ronnie's parents had taken with them to Texas in those picture books, and that they'd held onto for all those years.
I love bringing that statue to life and that part of Beirut's past back to life. And you can also look over and you see your father's tomb, and you can actually pay tribute to him. There's only one way to really recover from this kind of experience, and that is to share it and let it out. And I think I bottled it up. Being in the middle of it, standing where your father's buried, talking about the part of the city that matters most in its history, and letting it all out, I think you feel better afterwards.
And then the last stop on the tour is Samir Hassir Garden. It's this kind of calm, canopied fountain right in the middle of Beirut. And on the end of the bench is a statue of Samir Hassir, who was a well-known Lebanese journalist. And if you go further down the ledge, there's some inscriptions, which Ronnie kind of gathers everyone around and points them out. You know, he kind of asks if anyone in the group can read French, and someone puts their hand up and stands up on the bench and reads the quote in French.
Beirut, extraverti dans sa prospérité.
And then when he's done, Ronnie pulls a fez out from somewhere and puts it on his head as a gift. And then he reads the quote to us in English.
He starts off by saying Beirut, extraordinary, extroverted in its wealth and prosperity. We are still extraordinary in our wealth. But Beirut is as extraordinary, as extroverted in its decay and its ruins. Torn between stability and instability, between prosperity and war. Samir Hassir was obsessed with our history, and he was the first Lebanese killed after Rafiq Hariri's death. And I think his passion for our history cost him his life. And I think he got it right. And we saw a lot of Beirut's prosperity, but we saw as much of its decay. But I know for a fact we walked the streets the way he would have wanted. He was the inspiration for this tour many years ago. 13 years later, I hope the tour inspired you. The weather was terrific. You guys were fantastic. So thank you for joining. I appreciate it.
After the tour's over, everyone peels off into the early evening buzz of downtown Beirut. And coming away, you feel the heaviness of the city and the pains of its past. But you also feel and think about what makes the city so special. It's seen so many of history's great civilizations, and Ronnie makes a point of bringing all that's beautiful about Beirut to life as well. And I think he draws a line that's important when talking about Beirut's history. It's all-encompassing, but accessible in a way that doesn't romanticize or exaggerate. He's straightforward, and I think he's fair. It's not about him, it's about sharing his passion and his knowledge about where he's from.
The only way to actually live the city's history is to actually walk through it. And maybe get a little dirty in the process and sweaty and scream over construction and traffic and all those things. But that's the only way. At least in my opinion, I think. There's no better way of doing it.
If you need to walk to where we started, walk down this street and keep walking. In about 15 minutes, you'll reach the meeting point. Again, thank you so much, guys. Thank you.
This episode was produced by Alex Atack with editorial support by Dana Balutz and myself, Hibba Fisher. Sound design by Alex Atack. Ronnie's walking tours start again in September, and you can find out more about them at walkbeirut.com. Until next time.